Picture this. It's 20,000 years ago. You're standing in what is now frozen Siberia, but you wouldn't recognize it. The ground beneath your feet isn't permafrost, it's rich grassland. And in the distance, silhouetted against the horizon, you see them. A herd of woolly mammoths, their massive curved tusks glinting in the pale Arctic sun, their shaggy coats rippling as they move across the steppe. Now snap back to today. That same landscape? Barren tundra. Sparse, mossy, lifeless. The mammoths? Gone. Extinct for 10,000 years. Hunted to oblivion by our ancestors. But here's where it gets crazy. What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, scientists in Siberia are trying to bring that world back? Not with time travel, not with magic, but with animals, ecology, and one of the most ambitious experiments in the history of environmental science.
They call it Pleistocene Park, and it's not science fiction. It's happening right now. Welcome back to the channel. I'm going to tell you a story today that sounds absolutely insane, but every word of it is true. It's a story about how humans destroyed one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, how that destruction is now coming back to haunt us in the form of climate catastrophe, and how a father-son team of Russian scientists thinks they can fix it by essentially rebuilding the Ice Age.
By the end of this video, you're going to understand why some of the world's smartest scientists think that filling the Arctic with massive herds of bison, horses, and maybe, just maybe, genetically resurrected woolly mammoths could be one of our best weapons against runaway climate change. I know that sounds wild. Trust me, it gets wilder. So grab whatever you're drinking, get comfortable, and let's dive into one of the most fascinating scientific experiments happening on planet Earth right now.
To understand what Pleistocene Park is trying to accomplish, we need to travel back in time, way back. About 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age. If you could stand in northern Siberia back then, you wouldn't recognize it. Forget the sparse, mossy tundra we see today. Instead, imagine a vast, rolling grassland, stretching as far as the eye can see, further than you could walk in a week. This was the Mammoth Steppe, the most extensive biome on Earth during the Pleistocene epoch, covering millions of square kilometers from Spain to Canada. And it was absolutely teeming with life.
Herds of woolly mammoths, those iconic giants with their curved tusks and shaggy coats, roamed these grasslands by the millions. A single adult mammoth could stand 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weigh up to 6 tons. Their tusks could grow up to 15 feet long, curved and magnificent, used for digging through snow to reach grass, for fighting rivals, for impressing mates. But they weren't alone. Sharing this landscape were woolly rhinoceroses, bizarre, powerful creatures with 2 horns and a coat that rivaled the mammoths for thickness. There were steppe bison, larger and more robust than modern bison. Wild horses ran in huge herds, reindeer, musk oxen, saiga antelope, and even stranger creatures like the giant Irish elk with antlers spanning 12 feet.
And where there were herbivores, there were predators. Cave lions, the largest lions that ever lived, 25% bigger than modern African lions. Cave bears, dire wolves, short-faced bears that stood 11 feet tall on their hind legs. Even humans eventually arrived, armed with spears and cunning. This wasn't some frozen wasteland. This was one of the most productive ecosystems in Earth's history. The Mammoth Steppe supported more animal biomass per square kilometer than the African savanna does today. Think about that for a second. The Arctic, the region we now think of as barren and lifeless, once had more large animals than the Serengeti.
The grass that covered this landscape wasn't like modern Arctic vegetation. It was nutritious, protein-rich forage. The herbivores fertilized it constantly with their dung. They grazed it, which stimulated new growth. They trampled it, which prevented dead plant matter from accumulating. It was a self-sustaining, highly productive ecosystem maintained by the animals themselves. So, what happened? How did we go from a productive grassland filled with megafauna to the sparse tundra we see today? The answer is complex, but it centers on one animal in particular, the woolly mammoth, and more specifically, what happened when humans arrived on the scene.
Around 50,000 years ago, modern humans began spreading out of Africa and into Eurasia. We were armed with sophisticated stone tools, fire, language, and most importantly, the ability to cooperate in large groups to take down animals much larger than ourselves. And wherever humans went, something strange started happening. Large animals began to disappear.
This phenomenon, known as the Quaternary extinction event, or the megafaunal extinction, saw the loss of hundreds of species of large animals across the globe. In North America, we lost mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and dozens more. In Australia, giant wombats, massive kangaroos, and enormous monitor lizards vanished. In Europe and Asia, the list of casualties grew longer and longer. But nowhere was this more dramatic than in the mammoth steppe. The woolly mammoth, the keystone species of this entire ecosystem, was driven to extinction by human hunting. Now, there's been debate about this for decades. Some scientists argued that climate change was the primary culprit. After all, the Earth was warming as the Ice Age ended. The glaciers were retreating. Surely that would affect cold-adapted species like mammoths.
But the evidence increasingly points to human hunting as the decisive factor. And the evidence is damning. Here's why. Woolly mammoths had survived multiple previous warming periods over hundreds of thousands of years. They were adaptable. They had evolved to handle climate fluctuations. They'd made it through warm interglacials before. But they had never encountered human hunters armed with sophisticated weapons, coordinated hunting strategies, and fire. Archaeological sites across Eurasia tell a clear story. At Kostenki in Russia, we find mammoth bones with butchering marks, clear evidence of humans systematically processing mammoth carcasses for meat, fat, and ivory. At Predmosty in the Czech Republic, there's a structure built from the bones of at least 1,000 mammoths. At multiple sites across Siberia, we find mammoth kill sites where humans drove these giants into bogs or over cliffs.
Some of the most chilling evidence comes from the Channel Islands off California, where we found the remains of dwarf mammoths, a smaller species that evolved on the islands with clear evidence of human hunting. On Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, the last surviving population of woolly mammoths clung to existence until just 4,000 years ago, finally going extinct right around the time humans reached the island. The pattern is unmistakable. Mammoths survived everywhere until humans arrived. Then they disappeared. We find mammoth ivory carved into art, tools, and jewelry. We find cave paintings showing humans hunting mammoths. We find spear points embedded in mammoth bones. The evidence is overwhelming.
The mammoths never evolved defenses against this new super predator. They reproduced slowly. A female mammoth would reach sexual maturity around age 15 and might only have 5 to 6 offspring in her 60-year lifetime. They couldn't replace their losses fast enough, and one by one, population by population, they were hunted down. Imagine being a mammoth in those final generations. Your species had survived for millions of years. You'd weathered ice ages and warm periods. You'd evolved to thrive in the harshest conditions on Earth. And then, in what was essentially an evolutionary eye blink, you encountered a new predator that you simply couldn't defend against.
The last woolly mammoths on mainland Siberia died out around 10,000 years ago. A few isolated populations clung on, those dwarf mammoths on Wrangel Island surviving until 4,000 years ago, which is absolutely mind-blowing when you think about it. That's more recent than the construction of the pyramids in Egypt. There were still woolly mammoths alive when the Minoans were building palaces on Crete. But eventually, they too disappeared, and with them went the entire ecosystem they supported.
When the woolly mammoths vanished, they didn't go alone. The mammoth steppe began to collapse. You see, mammoths weren't just big animals grazing on grass. They were ecosystem engineers, species whose activities fundamentally shaped the environment around them. Let me explain what I mean by that, because this is crucial to understanding why Pleistocene Park even exists. A single adult woolly mammoth could weigh up to 6 tons. These animals needed to eat around 180 kilograms, that's almost 400 pounds, of vegetation every single day. Now multiply that by millions of mammoths, plus millions of other large herbivores, and you start to understand the incredible ecological pressure these animals exerted on the landscape.
They were constantly grazing, trampling, knocking down trees, and spreading nutrients through their dung. In winter, they would use their tusks like shovels to dig through snow, sometimes through several feet of snow, to reach grass beneath. This behavior kept areas clear and prevented snow from insulating the ground too effectively. Mammoths would knock down trees almost casually. A young tree trying to establish itself in the grassland, a mammoth might rub against it to scratch an itch, snapping it in half, or simply trample it while walking. This constant disturbance prevented forests from encroaching and maintained the open grassland ecosystem.
Their dung was crucial too. A single mammoth could produce hundreds of pounds of nutrient-rich manure every day. This fertilized the grasslands, promoting lush growth. And because they traveled widely, they spread seeds across vast distances, maintaining genetic diversity in plant populations. But when humans hunted the mammoths to extinction, along with many other megafauna species, everything changed, and it changed fast. Without large animals to graze it down, grass began to be replaced by moss. Moss doesn't have the same nutritional value. It doesn't have deep roots to stabilize soil. It doesn't create the same kind of ecosystem. Without animals to trample young trees and saplings, shrubs and forests began to spread. Dark forests replaced light-colored grasslands. Without millions of large herbivores fertilizing the soil with their nutrient-rich droppings, the grasslands became less productive. The soil chemistry changed. Without animals digging through snow in winter, the snow lay undisturbed, creating a thick insulating layer that trapped heat in the ground. The mammoth steppe transformed into the tundra we see today, a landscape dominated by moss, shrubs, and sparse forests. The loss of the mammoths triggered a cascade effect that fundamentally altered one of Earth's largest biomes. Think of it like removing a keystone from an arch. The mammoths were the keystone. When they were removed, the entire structure collapsed into a fundamentally different configuration. And here's the really important part. This transformation didn't just change what the landscape looked like. It changed how the landscape functions, particularly in relation to our current climate crisis. Because what lies beneath that tundra is something that should terrify all of us.
Let's talk about permafrost.
because this is where the story goes from interesting ecological history to, holy crap, we need to do something about this right now. Permafrost is permanently frozen ground. It exists in the Arctic and subarctic regions, and it's not just frozen dirt, it's frozen organic matter. Dead plants, dead animals, everything that died in these regions over thousands of years, sometimes tens of thousands of years, is essentially locked in a natural freezer beneath your feet. When the mammoth steppe transitioned to tundra, all that organic matter that would have been eaten, digested, and recycled by megafauna instead accumulated in the soil. Then it froze, and it's been frozen ever since.
And here's the terrifying part. The Arctic permafrost contains an estimated 1,600 billion tons of carbon. Let me put that in perspective. That's roughly twice as much carbon as is currently in Earth's entire atmosphere. It's more carbon than is contained in all the world's forests combined. It's a carbon bomb. As long as this organic matter stays frozen, it's not a problem. It's locked away, safely sequestered. But if the permafrost thaws, microbes will start breaking down all that organic material, releasing greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide and methane, into the atmosphere. And methane is particularly nasty. It's about 25 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. In the short term, it's even worse, about 80 times more potent over 20 years. This creates a feedback loop that keeps climate scientists awake at night. Warming causes permafrost to thaw. Thawing permafrost releases greenhouse gases. More greenhouse gases cause more warming, which causes more thawing. You can see where this is going. The Arctic is warming faster than any other region on Earth, about 4 times faster than the global average. Some parts of the Arctic have warmed by more than 3 degrees Celsius just in the last few decades. Permafrost that has been frozen for thousands of years is beginning to thaw. In some areas, the ground is literally collapsing, creating what scientists call thermokarst, a landscape of sinkholes, slumping hillsides, and unstable ground. Buildings in Arctic towns are tilting as their foundations sink. Roads are buckling. The landscape is becoming unrecognizable.
And as the permafrost thaws, we're already seeing methane bubbling up from lakes. Scientists can literally light this methane on fire. There are videos of researchers on frozen Arctic lakes poking holes in the ice and lighting the escaping methane. It's dramatic, visceral, and terrifying. So the question becomes, is there anything we can do to slow down permafrost thaw? This is where most climate discussions become depressing because the answer usually involves massive global cooperation, economic transformation, and changes that seem politically impossible.
But Sergei Zimov had a different idea. What if we could use nature itself to help protect the permafrost? What if we could use animals, the same ecological force that maintained the mammoth steppe for hundreds of thousands of years? What if we could bring back the functional equivalent of woolly mammoths?
In 1996, a Russian ecologist named Sergei Zimov had a radical idea. And I mean radical in the truest sense, going to the root of the problem. Zimov had spent decades studying the Arctic ecosystem. He ran a research station in Chersky, a remote town in northeastern Siberia. He understood the permafrost problem. He understood climate change, but he also understood something that many scientists had overlooked. The transformation from mammoth steppe to tundra wasn't just a consequence of climate change, it was a consequence of losing the animals. His hypothesis was simple but revolutionary. If the loss of megafauna transformed grassland into tundra, Could bringing back megafauna transform tundra back into grassland? And more importantly, could restored grassland help protect the permafrost?
Zimov proposed that large herbivores could help keep the Arctic cold through several mechanisms. Let me break these down because they're really clever. First, by trampling snow in winter. This might sound counterintuitive, but compacted snow is much less insulating than fluffy snow. Think about how much warmer a snow fort feels than standing outside. That's because the air trapped in snow acts as insulation. When animals trample the snow, they compress it, squeezing out that air, reducing its insulating effect. This allows winter cold to penetrate deeper into the ground, keeping the permafrost frozen.
Zimov's measurements showed that areas trampled by animals could be 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder at ground level than untrampled areas. That's enormous. Second, by promoting grasslands over shrubs and forests. This gets into something called albedo, how much sunlight a surface reflects. Fresh snow reflects about 80 to 90% of sunlight. Grassland reflects about 25 to 30%. But dark shrubs and trees, they might only reflect 10 to 15%. They absorb more heat. By keeping the landscape open and grassy, rather than allowing it to become shrubby or forested, large herbivores could help the Arctic stay cooler.
Third, by encouraging deep-rooted grasses that can sequester carbon more effectively in the soil. Grasslands are actually remarkably good at carbon storage, not in the vegetation itself, but in the massive root systems underground. Some grass species have roots that go down 15 feet or more. Now, Zimov couldn't bring back woolly mammoths. In 1996, cloning technology wasn't there. We still had barely sequenced the human genome. Bringing back an extinct species seemed like pure fantasy. But Zimov realized something important. He didn't necessarily need mammoths. He needed their ecological function. He needed large animals that could graze, trample, knock down trees, and cycle nutrients.
And those animals? They still existed. So in 1996, he established Pleistocene Park, a 160 square kilometer testing ground in northeastern Siberia near his research station in Chersky to test his hypothesis. It was an insane gamble. He had limited funding, harsh conditions, and an idea that most scientists thought was somewhere between ambitious and completely crazy. But he was determined to try.
Pleistocene Park started small. Zimov, along with his son Nikita, who would eventually take over much of the project's management, began by introducing a few animals to the fenced area. They started with Yakutian horses, a hardy breed adapted to extreme cold that can survive temperatures down to -60 degrees Celsius. These weren't just any horses. Yakutian horses are probably the closest living equivalent to the wild horses that once roamed the mammoth steppe. They're stocky, with incredibly thick winter coats. They can dig through snow to find grass. They're tough, resilient, and perfect for the experiment.
Then they added reindeer. Then moose, massive animals that can weigh up to 700 kilograms. Then musk oxen, shaggy Ice Age survivors that look like they walked straight out of the Pleistocene, because in a sense, they did. Musk oxen are one of the few large Ice Age herbivores that survived the extinction event. They brought in yaks from Mongolia, sheep, cattle, and eventually bison, the closest living relative to the steppe bison that once roamed alongside mammoths. Each species added a different ecological function. Horses graze differently than cattle. Moose browse on shrubs. Bison are powerful enough to knock down small trees.
The idea wasn't to create a zoo or a nature preserve where humans carefully managed every aspect.
It was to increase animal density until the animals themselves began reshaping the landscape through their natural behaviors, grazing, trampling, knocking down trees, fertilizing the soil, competing for resources. This was rewilding in its purest form. Not preservation, but restoration. Not maintaining what's there, but actively rebuilding what was lost. And you know what? It started working. Areas with higher animal density showed remarkable changes. The animals grazed down moss and promoted grass growth. They trampled shrubs and prevented tree encroachment. In winter, their constant movement through the snow compacted it, and temperature measurements showed that the ground in these areas stayed several degrees colder than in areas without animals. Zimov and his team installed temperature sensors throughout the park. The data was clear. Areas with high animal density were staying colder. The permafrost was more stable. The hypothesis was being supported by real-world data. Over the years, the Zimovs have continued to increase animal numbers and diversity. Today, Pleistocene Park contains hundreds of animals representing multiple species. Some years are harder than others. Winters are brutal, food can be scarce, and not every animal survives. But overall, the population is growing.
The park has expanded too. What started as 160 square kilometers is growing, with plans to eventually expand to thousands of square kilometers if the experiment continues to show promise. But here's where it gets really interesting. Pleistocene Park isn't alone anymore. Around the world, other scientists and conservationists have been watching, and they've started their own rewilding experiments. Recent studies have shown something remarkable. Large mammals are expanding northward across Eurasia. Some of this is natural range expansion. As climate changes, animals are following their preferred habitats as those habitats shift north. But much of it is intentional rewilding. Scientists and conservationists reintroducing species to areas where they historically lived but had been extirpated.
European bison are being reintroduced in multiple countries across Europe. These animals were hunted to near extinction in the wild, with only 54 individuals surviving in captivity by 1927. Now there are thousands, and they're being released into protected areas where they're beginning to reshape the landscape just like their ancestors did. Musk oxen, which were hunted to extinction in Eurasia but survived in North America, are being reintroduced to their historical range. There are now musk ox populations in Norway, Sweden, and Russia that didn't exist 50 years ago. Wild horses, or rather horses that live wild, are being established in various regions. The Przewalski's horse, the only truly wild horse species that never was domesticated, is being bred in captivity and reintroduced to Mongolia and other parts of its historical range.
Even in North America, there are efforts to restore bison to something approaching their historical range and numbers. Before European colonization, there may have been 30 to 60 million bison in North America. By 1889, only about 1,000 remained. Now there are about 500,000, and conservationists are working to expand both numbers and range. This phenomenon, dubbed megafaunal enrichment by researchers, suggests that Arctic and subarctic ecosystems can support far more large herbivores than they currently do. Think about what this means. For 10,000 years, since humans hunted the mammoths and other megafauna to extinction, these ecosystems have been missing their large animals. They've been incomplete, running at half capacity, like an engine missing half its cylinders.
And now, For the first time since the end of the Ice Age, we're seeing these animals return. It's not the same as it was. We can't bring back mammoths or woolly rhinos or giant ground sloths, but we can restore some of the ecological functions these animals provided. And the evidence suggests that when we do, ecosystems respond. Grasslands expand. Biodiversity increases. The land becomes more productive. Soil health improves. Carbon sequestration increases. It's like the ecosystem remembers what it's supposed to be.
Of course, we can't talk about Pleistocene rewilding without addressing the elephant, or rather, mammoth, in the room. Can we actually bring back woolly mammoths? There are scientists working on this right now. The most prominent effort is led by geneticist George Church at Harvard, working with a company called Colossal Biosciences that has raised over $200 million to pursue de-extinction projects. Their approach involves using CRISPR gene editing to modify Asian elephant DNA. Elephants are the closest living relatives of mammoths, sharing a common ancestor about 6 million years ago, to give them mammoth traits.
We're talking about cold-adapted hemoglobin that functions better in freezing temperatures, thick, woolly, double-layered coats with long guard hairs, smaller ears to reduce heat loss, subcutaneous fat layers for insulation, high-domed skulls, all the adaptations that allowed mammoths to thrive in Ice Age conditions. The goal isn't necessarily to create a perfect mammoth clone that's genetically identical to the mammoths that went extinct 10,000 years ago. It's to create a cold-adapted elephant that could fulfill the ecological role that mammoths once played, a functional mammoth, if you will, an elephant that could survive and thrive in the Arctic. Now, there are huge ethical and practical questions here. Even if we can create mammoth-like creatures, and that's still a big if, should we? Where would they live? Who would manage them? What are the ecological risks of introducing a novel organism into modern ecosystems? What about the elephants used as surrogates? Is it ethical to subject them to experimental pregnancies? What about the welfare of the resulting offspring if something goes wrong? And perhaps most fundamentally, do we have the right to bring back a species we drove to extinction, especially if we haven't addressed the underlying causes of extinction in the first place? But here's the thing. The Zimovs and other rewilding advocates argue that we don't need to wait for mammoths to be resurrected. The animals we have right now, bison, horses, musk oxen, can already start doing the work. They're already reshaping landscapes. They're already influencing permafrost stability. And if mammoth-like creatures are ever successfully created, well, there would be a place ready for them. Pleistocene Park would welcome them. Sergei Zimov has said publicly that if scientists successfully recreate a mammoth, Pleistocene Park would be ready to receive them. Imagine that. Woolly mammoths once again walking the Siberian landscape, 10,000 years after humans drove their ancestors to extinction. It would be a kind of redemption, wouldn't it? Humanity undoing a fraction of the damage we caused at the end of the Ice Age, bringing back, in a sense, what we destroyed.
But not everyone is convinced that Pleistocene rewilding is a good idea or that it will work at scale. Critics raise several important points, and they deserve to be taken seriously because this is science, not religion. We need skepticism. We need people poking holes in the hypothesis. First, the climate impact might be too small to matter at a global scale. Even if rewilding works perfectly in Pleistocene Park, that's only 160 square kilometers. The Arctic tundra covers millions of square kilometers, about 8 million square kilometers total. Scaling up to a meaningful size would require millions of animals spread across an enormous area.
Some calculations suggest you'd need animal densities similar to what existed during the Pleistocene, perhaps 15 to 20 large animals per square kilometer. Across the entire Arctic, that would mean hundreds of millions of large herbivores. The logistical challenges are staggering.
Second, managing such a massive population of large herbivores would be incredibly challenging. Who would fund it? Who would manage it? What happens when animals move outside designated areas? In many parts of the Arctic, there are human communities, infrastructure, mining operations, oil fields, and economic activities. How do you reconcile large-scale rewilding with human land use? Third, there are ecological uncertainties. The Arctic today is not the Arctic of the Pleistocene. The climate is different, the vegetation is different. Many species that existed then are gone forever. Can you really recreate an ancient ecosystem in a modern world? Isn't that like trying to run Windows 95 software on a modern computer? Technically possible, but probably not optimal?
Some ecologists worry about unintended consequences. What if introduced herbivores damage vulnerable plant communities that have adapted to the current conditions? What if they affect other wildlife in unexpected ways? What if they spread diseases? What if the whole project ends up causing more ecological harm than good? And perhaps most fundamentally, some scientists question whether the premise is correct. Is the loss of megafauna really what transformed steppe to tundra, or was climate the dominant driver? If climate was more important, then bringing back animals might not have the desired effect. You'd be treating the symptom, not the disease. There's also the question of timescale. Even if rewilding works perfectly, permafrost thaw is happening now. We don't have centuries to wait for ecosystem transformation. Can rewilding act fast enough to make a difference? These are all legitimate concerns that deserve serious consideration. Science progresses through this kind of rigorous questioning.
So with all these challenges and uncertainties, why pursue Pleistocene rewilding at all? I think there are several compelling reasons, even if the project never scales up to transform the entire Arctic. First, it's a real-world scientific experiment that tests fundamental ecological questions. How do ecosystems respond when missing species are restored? What role do large herbivores play in shaping landscapes? Can ecological engineering act as a climate mitigation tool? How resilient are ecosystems to restoration efforts? These are questions we can't answer just by building computer models or doing small-scale studies in labs. We need landscape-level experiments that run for decades. We need to see how complex systems respond to interventions. And Pleistocene Park is providing that.
The data coming out of Pleistocene Park is already valuable. Temperature measurements showing how animal activity affects ground temperature, vegetation surveys showing how plant communities change with grazing pressure, soil analyses showing changes in carbon storage. This is real science producing real data. Second, it's forcing us to think differently about conservation and restoration. For too long, conservation has been defensive. It's been about preserving what's left, drawing lines on maps and saying, protect this. That's important work, but it's inherently limited. Pleistocene rewilding is offensive, in the military sense, not the insulting sense. It's about actively rebuilding what was lost. It's about restoration, not just preservation. It's a more ambitious, more hopeful vision of what conservation can be. What if conservation isn't just about preventing further losses, but about undoing past damage? What if we can actually make things better, not just slow down how fast they get worse?
Third, the research coming out of Pleistocene Park has applications beyond the Arctic.
Understanding how large herbivores influence ecosystems is relevant to rewilding projects around the world. The lessons learned in Siberia might inform conservation efforts in Africa, Europe, North America, Australia, and elsewhere. The principles are universal. Large animals shape their environments. Removing them fundamentally changes ecosystems. Restoring them can help restore ecosystem function. Fourth, there's something powerful about the idea of humans taking responsibility for damage we caused. Yes, our ancestors hunted mammoths to extinction 10,000 years ago, but we're not bound by their mistakes. We have the knowledge and technology to try to restore some of what was lost. That's a fundamentally optimistic worldview. It says that we're not just passengers on a runaway train heading toward environmental catastrophe. We're agents who can make choices. We can try to fix things.
And finally, even if Pleistocene rewilding never becomes a major climate solution, it's already succeeding as a proof of concept. It's showing that degraded Arctic ecosystems can be restored. It's demonstrating that these landscapes can support abundant wildlife. It's providing hope in a time when environmental news is often depressing. Hope isn't just a nice feeling, it's a practical necessity. People don't fight for causes they think are hopeless. Pleistocene Park shows that restoration is possible. That gives people a reason to care, to act, to invest resources in solutions.
So, where does all this leave us? Pleistocene Park is an ongoing experiment. The Zimovs continue to add animals, monitor the land, and collect data. They're building new enclosures. They're introducing new species. They're refining their methods based on years of observations. Other rewilding projects across the Arctic are providing additional data points. Scientists are collaborating, sharing information, testing hypotheses. And somewhere in a lab, researchers are working on editing elephant DNA, trying to create something that looks and acts like a woolly mammoth. That work continues, slowly, carefully, with all the ethical debates and technical challenges that entails. We don't know yet if Pleistocene rewilding will work at a scale that matters for climate change. We don't know if mammoth-like creatures will ever walk the Earth again. We don't know if we can truly turn tundra back into steppe.
But we do know this. 10,000 years ago, humans arrived in the mammoth steppe and drove the woolly mammoths to extinction through hunting. Our ancestors, armed with spears and fire and cunning, wiped out one of the most magnificent animals that ever lived. Our actions triggered a cascade effect that transformed one of Earth's most productive ecosystems into the sparse tundra we see today. We broke something that had worked for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, we're trying to undo some of that damage. We're trying to bring back the animals, or at least their ecological equivalents. We're trying to restore the grasslands, protect the permafrost, and stabilize the climate. We're trying to learn from our past mistakes and build a better future. Whether or not Pleistocene Park succeeds in all its goals, it represents something important: humanity's capacity for not just destruction, but restoration. Our ability to not just take from nature, but to give back.
The mammoth steppe is gone. The woolly mammoths are extinct. We can't change that. But their ecological legacy, the role they played in shaping the Arctic, maintaining grasslands, cycling nutrients, influencing climate, might not be lost forever. And that's a story worth following. That's a future worth fighting for. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into science, ecology, and environmental topics. Let me know in the comments, Do you think Pleistocene rewilding can work? Should we try to bring back mammoths? Would you visit Pleistocene Park if you could? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.